November 21. The banks of the Indus River, somewhere in what we now call Pakistan. The sun is high, merciless. The air shimmers with heat and dust, and the acrid smell of war. A man on horseback stands at the edge of a cliff. Below him, the river churns, brown and swollen with mountain runoff, 20 feet down, maybe more. The current is vicious. Behind him, 30,000 men are dying. The sound is chaos, steel on steel, screaming, the wet thud of arrows finding flesh. His army, what's left of it, is breaking apart like wet paper. And coming through the smoke and blood, advancing with the methodical precision of men who've never lost, are the Mongols. The man's name is Jalal al-Din Mingburnu. He's 30 years old. 3 months ago, he did something no one else in the world had managed to do in 15 years. He defeated the Mongol army in open battle. So why is he about to jump off a cliff into a raging river with a high probability of drowning? That's the question, isn't it? That's the story we're going to tell. Because what happened at Parwan in September 1221 wasn't just a battle. It was the moment the unstoppable force discovered it could be stopped. It was proof that the Mongol Empire, for all its terrifying efficiency, wasn't invincible. But here's the thing about victory. Sometimes winning the battle is just the first step toward losing the war. Let's go back 4 months. Let's understand how we got here. If you want to understand what Jalal al-Din accomplished, you first need to understand what he was up against. The Mongol war machine in 1221 wasn't just another army, it was the most sophisticated military organization on the planet, bar none. Genghis Khan had spent 20 years building this thing. Every other contemporary force looked like a medieval reenactment by comparison. Start with organization. The Mongols used a decimal system, units of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000. Every warrior knew exactly where he fit in the hierarchy. Communication was instantaneous by medieval standards. Flag signals, smoke, mounted couriers who could ride 100 kilometers in a single day. When European knights were still arguing about who got to charge first, the Mongols were coordinating complex multi-corps operations across hundreds of miles. Their equipment was cutting edge. Those composite bows everyone talks about? 300-meter effective range. They could punch through most armor of the period. Each Mongol warrior carried multiple bows and 60 arrows. They could fire from horseback at full gallop with deadly accuracy. But the real weapon wasn't the bow. It was the tactics. Forget everything you think you know about medieval warfare. The Mongols pioneered feigned retreats, pincer movements, psychological warfare on an industrial scale. They'd pretend to run, lure you into chasing them, then wheel around and destroy your disordered forces. They'd been drilling these maneuvers since childhood. It was bred into them. And here's the statistic that should terrify you. From 1206, when Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes, to September 1221, they hadn't lost a single major pitched battle. Not one. 15 years of continuous warfare across Asia. Their record was perfect. Cities fell. Armies crumbled. Empires collapsed. The Mongols just kept winning. Now let's talk about what they did to the Khwarezmian Empire. In 1219, the Khwarezmian Empire was one of the most powerful Muslim states of its time. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India. Rich, sophisticated, militarily strong, Shah Muhammad II ruled from Samarkand. He commanded armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. He had reason to be confident. Then he made a mistake. The details don't matter for our story. What matters is this. Genghis Khan asked for trade. The Shah's governor killed the Mongol merchants. Genghis asked for justice. The Shah killed the ambassadors. You don't kill Mongol ambassadors. What followed was systematic, methodical, terrifying in its efficiency. Bukhara fell in 3 days. The Mongols herded the population into the Great Mosque, then used the city as a logistics base. When they left, Bukhara was burning. Samarkand held out for 5 days. 5 days against 100,000 Mongol warriors. When the city surrendered, the Mongols executed the garrison. 30,000 men. They spared the craftsmen. Everyone else was either enslaved or killed. But Nishapur. Nishapur is where you see what the Mongols were capable of when they were angry. A Mongol general died during the siege. His wife asked Genghis for revenge. The Khan said yes. When Nishapur fell, the Mongols killed everyone. Every man, woman, child. They killed the animals, the cats, the dogs. They burned the fields. They destroyed the irrigation systems. Medieval chroniclers claim they even cut down the trees. They called it the city that was. Shah Muhammad ran. He fled from city to city, watching his empire disintegrate around him. In early 1221, he died alone on an island in the Caspian Sea, probably wondering where it all went wrong. His empire was finished. His sons had fled or surrendered or died. All except one, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu. If you're writing a movie, you couldn't create a better underdog protagonist. He was 30 years old in 1221. The son of Shah Muhammad, yes, but his mother was a Turkic slave. In the aristocratic hierarchy of the Khwarezmian court, that made him illegitimate, second class. His legitimate half-brothers had been groomed for power. Jalal had been overlooked. But here's what his legitimate brothers didn't have: actual military talent. While they were learning court politics and poetry, Jalal was learning war. He'd campaigned alongside his father. He'd commanded troops. He'd studied tactics, logistics, the art of holding men together under pressure. When the Mongol invasion began, his brothers surrendered or ran. Jalal stood his ground. By the summer of 1221, he was all that was left. 10,000 men, maybe fewer, remnants of the Khwarezmian professional military, battle-hardened, loyal, but hopelessly outnumbered. Most commanders would have run, would have crossed into India or Persia, lived to fight another day, accepted that the empire was lost. Jalal didn't run. He retreated to Ghazni, a fortress city in the mountains of what's now Afghanistan, and he started building something. Here's where the story gets interesting. Because word was spreading across Central Asia, word about what the Mongols had done, the cities they'd burned, the populations they'd slaughtered, the calculated, systematic brutality of their conquest, and people were starting to ask themselves a question: is surrender really safer than fighting? The answer came at Bamiyan. Bamiyan was a Buddhist city in the Hindu Kush Mountains, beautiful, ancient, the kind of place that had survived for centuries by being remote and defensible. The Mongols besieged it in the spring of 1221. During the siege, an arrow from the walls killed a young Mongol officer. His name was Mutugan. He was 20 years old. He was Genghis Khan's grandson. When the Khan learned his grandson was dead, he gave an order. When Bamiyan falls, he said, kill everything, every person, every animal. Destroy the buildings, raze the city to the ground, and when you're done, change its name. From now on, call it the City of Sorrows. The Mongols were thorough. Medieval chroniclers, writing decades later, said that nothing lived in Bamiyan after the Mongols left. The irrigation systems were destroyed. The fields were salted. The place became a ghost town. The message was clear: this is what resistance costs. But the message had an unintended effect. 30,000 Afghan warriors came down from the Hindu Kush Mountains. Think about that for a moment. These weren't professional soldiers. They were tribesmen, highlanders, men who made their living herding goats and defending mountain passes. Some of them were fighting with weapons their grandfathers had used, but they came down from those mountains after hearing what happened at Bamiyan. They came down because they understood something fundamental. If this is what happens to cities that surrender, then surrender isn't an option. Their leader was named Saif al-Din Igrak. He was 45 years old, a chieftain from the high valleys, the kind of man who could track a deer across bare rock and knew every pass and ridge of the Hindu Kush by heart. He brought his 30,000 men to Ghazni, to Jalal al-Din, and suddenly the dynamic changed. Jalal now had 40,000 men, 10,000 Khwarezmian regulars, cavalry, professional soldiers who'd served under his father, and 30,000 Afghans who knew the terrain like they knew their own faces. But he needed more. He reached out to the Turkish contingents, to Amin Malik, who happened to be his father-in-law. Malik was 50 years old, a seasoned commander who'd survived decades of Central Asian warfare. He brought another 10,000 men, solid troops, cavalry who could match the Mongols stride for stride. Another figure emerged from the chaos. Temur Malik, 38 years old, led a mixed contingent of Persian cavalry and infantry survivors, not as many as Igrak or Amin Malik brought, maybe 3,000. But these were hardened fighters who'd survived the initial Mongol onslaught and had nothing left to lose. 60,000 men. It should have been impossible. The empire was finished. The Shah was dead. Cities were surrendering without a fight. Nobles were fleeing in every direction. But Jalal al-Din was building an army. Let's pause here for a moment and talk about leadership. Because what Jalal did in those summer months of 1221 is a case study in holding disparate forces together. He had professional Khwarezmian cavalry who'd served his father, Turkish allies commanded by his father-in-law, Afghan tribesmen who'd never fought in a formal army, Persian survivors still traumatized from watching their cities burn, different languages, different fighting styles, different ideas about discipline and command structure. And somehow, he made it work. He gave the Afghans the high ground positions, let them fight the way they knew how, gave the professionals the cavalry roles, used the Turks as shock troops, positioned Temur Malik's Persians where their experience would matter most. He adapted his tactics to his men, not the other way around. But more than that, he gave them something to believe in. For 2 years, people across Central Asia had watched the Mongols win. Every time, without fail, cities that resisted were destroyed. Armies that fought were annihilated. The message from every battlefield was the same. Resistance is futile. Jalal said no. He said the Mongols can be beaten. He said, we're going to prove it. And somehow 60,000 men believed him. By late August 1221, Genghis Khan knew Jalal was gathering forces at Ghazni. The Khan had just finished consolidating his control over what remained of the Khwarezmian Empire. His sons were pacifying the outlying regions. Rebellions were being crushed. The systematic destruction of resistance was proceeding on schedule. Jalal al-Din was an irritant, a loose end, the last prince of a dead empire holed up in the mountains with a collection of survivors and refugees. Genghis could have gone after him personally, could have brought the full weight of the Mongol army down on Ghazni and finished this in a week. He didn't. Instead, he sent Shigi Kutuku. Now, here's where you need to understand something about Shigi. He was Genghis Khan's adopted son. Found on a battlefield as a child raised in the Khan's household. Genghis trusted him completely. But Shigi's job wasn't commanding armies. He was 32 years old, the empire's chief justice, a scholar, an administrator, one of the first Mongols to learn to read and write. He'd been instrumental in codifying Mongol law, creating the legal framework that held the empire together. Commanding 30,000 troops in enemy territory, that wasn't exactly his specialty. Genghis gave him 30,000 cavalry. Good troops, veterans. More than enough, the Khan probably thought, to deal with a refugee prince and a rabble of mountain fighters. It was a cleanup mission, mop-up duty. That was the first mistake. Jalal al-Din received word in early September that a Mongol army was approaching. He called his commanders together. Amin Malik, Saif al-Din Igrak, Temur Malik, his senior officers. They spread maps across a table in the fortress at Ghazni. The question was simple. Where do we fight them? Fighting on the plains was suicide. The Mongols excelled in open terrain. Their cavalry could maneuver, could execute those feigned retreats and pincer movements that had destroyed every army that faced them. On flat ground, even with 60,000 men, Jalal would lose. He needed terrain that would neutralize the Mongol advantages. Igrak leaned over the map, put his finger on a spot northeast of Ghazni. Parwan Valley, he said. Jalal looked at the map, looked at Igrak. "Tell me about it." Igrak described the valley, narrow, maybe a few hundred meters wide at most, carved between steep ridges of the Hindu Kush, rock walls on both sides, limited entry points, the kind of place where you couldn't maneuver large cavalry formations, the kind of place where numbers mattered less than position. "If we hold the high ground," Igrak said, "they'll have to come through the valley floor. They can't flank us, can't use their mobility. We can rain arrows down from above, pin them in place." Amin Malik, Jalal's father-in-law, nodded slowly. "It's defensible. But if it goes wrong, there's no retreat. We'd be trapped." "We're not retreating," Jalal said. He traced the valley on the map with his finger, thought about what he knew of Mongol tactics. They relied on speed, flexibility, the ability to adapt formation mid-battle. Take that away, force them to fight in a constrained space, and suddenly the equation changed. "We march to Parwan," he said. "We dig in on the ridges, and when the Mongols come, we make them fight on our terms." It was a gamble, a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble, but it was also brilliant. The army moved out in mid-September, 60,000 men, cavalry, infantry, Afghan Highlanders who moved through mountain terrain like water, refugees and camp followers who refused to be left behind, who'd rather take their chances with Jalal than wait for the Mongols to arrive at Ghazni. They reached Parwan Valley on September 11th. Jalal stood at the entrance to the valley and looked up at the ridges. The rock walls rose steep and jagged on both sides. The valley floor was maybe 300 meters wide, narrow enough. He turned to his commanders. "Afghans on the heights," he said. "Both ridges. I want archers positioned where they can cover the entire valley floor. If a Mongol sneezes down there, I want you to be able to hit him with an arrow." Igrak grinned. His men knew these mountains. This was their terrain. "Cavalry in reserve," Jalal continued. "Amin Malik, you're with me. Tamir, position your Persians on the high ground behind the Afghan line. When the moment comes, we're going to hit them hard, but not until I give the signal." "And if they don't come into the valley?" one of the officers asked. "They'll come," Jalal said. "They've never backed down from a fight. Why would they start now?" Over the next 2 days, the coalition forces dug in. The Afghans took positions on the ridges, building rock sangars for cover. Temur Malik's Persians fortified secondary positions. The Khwarezmian regulars set up defensive works at the valley entrance. Cavalry units stayed mobile, ready to move on command. Jalal walked the positions personally, checked sight lines, made sure his archers had clear fields of fire, talked to the men, listened to what they had to say. He knew what was coming. 30,000 Mongol cavalry, veterans of 100 battles, men who'd swept across Asia without losing. But for the first time in this entire nightmare campaign, Jalal had an advantage. He knew the ground. The Mongols didn't. On September 12th, scouts reported Mongol cavalry approaching from the south, 30,000 riders, moving fast, dust rising behind them like a storm cloud. At the head of the column rode Shigi Kutuku. He'd been 7 days on the march from Ghazni. His orders were simple: find Jalal al-Din, destroy his force, pacify the region. The Khan wanted this finished before winter. Shigi expected this to take a week, maybe 2 if Jalal decided to hole up in some mountain fortress. The Mongols were experts at siege warfare. They'd taken cities that were supposed to be impregnable. One refugee prince with a collection of survivors? This should be straightforward. When his scouts reported that Jalal had taken a defensive position at Parwan Valley, Shigi rode forward to see for himself. He stood at the valley entrance, looked at the ridges, saw the defensive positions. One of his officers rode up beside him. "It's a trap," the officer said. "Of course it's a trap," Shigi replied. "The question is whether it's a good one." He studied the terrain. Narrow valley, high ground on both sides. Jalal's forces dug in along the ridges. It was exactly the kind of position you'd choose if you wanted to negate superior cavalry. Shigi had read military treatises. He knew the theory. Terrain mattered. Sun Tzu had written about it. So had the Chinese strategists whose works the Mongols had translated. But theory was one thing. The reality was this: the Mongol army didn't lose. They'd beaten enemies in mountains before. They'd adapted to every terrain from the steppes to the forests to the cities. Why should this be different? "We probe their defenses," Shigi said. "Find the weak points. Then we break them." The officer nodded, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of doubt. The ridges were steep. The valley was narrow. This wasn't going to be easy. That night, in the Khwarezmian camp, Jalal sat with his senior commanders around a fire. The mood was tense. Tomorrow the probing attacks would begin. Tomorrow they'd find out if their defensive positions could hold. Amin Malik poured wine, passed cups around. "They're going to test us," he said. "Try to find where we're weak." "Let them test," Igrak said. "My men have been fighting in these mountains for 30 years. The Mongols are riders, plains fighters. Up here they're at a disadvantage." Jalal didn't say anything for a moment. He stared into the fire. "They're not helpless," he finally said. "They're the best army in the world for a reason. They adapt. They learn. If we make a mistake, they'll exploit it." "So we don't make mistakes," Malik said. Jalal looked at him, then at Igrak, then at Timur and his other officers. "Discipline," he said. "That's what wins this. When the Mongols do their feigned retreats, when they pretend to run, nobody chases. Nobody breaks formation. We hold, we wait. We make them come to us." "And if they don't?" an officer asked. "They will," Jalal said, "because they can't afford not to. Genghis Khan sent Shigi here to finish this, to prove that resistance is futile. If Shigi turns around and goes back empty-handed, it sends a message across the empire. The Mongols can be stalled." He leaned forward. "That's why they'll come. That's why they'll fight. And that's why we're going to win." The officers looked at each other. Some nodded. Some looked uncertain. But they believed, or at least they wanted to believe. That night Jalal lay on his bedroll and stared at the stars. Somewhere down in that valley, 30,000 Mongol warriors were sleeping, men who'd never lost, who'd conquered half of Asia, who probably thought this would be over in a few days. Tomorrow he was going to show them they were wrong. Tomorrow the battle would begin, and 3 days from now, one way or another, this would be over. Jalal closed his eyes, tried to sleep, but his mind kept racing. He thought about his father, dead somewhere on an island in the Caspian Sea. He thought about his half-brothers, who'd surrendered or fled. He thought about the cities the Mongols had burned, the people they'd killed. And he thought about tomorrow. No force is invincible, he told himself. Every giant has a weakness. Find the weakness, exploit it, win. It sounded simple when he put it that way. But as he finally drifted off to sleep, one thought kept echoing in his mind. I'm about to fight the Mongol army, the real Mongol army, the force that hasn't lost in 15 years. And I have to win, because if I don't, everything ends here. Dawn came on September 13th, 1221. The sun rose over the Hindu Kush, painting the rock faces gold and red. In the valley of Parwan, 60,000 men prepared for war, and from the south, dust rising like smoke, came 30,000 Mongol riders. The battle was about to begin. The first day was a chess match. September 13th, 1221. Morning light spilled across Parwan Valley like liquid gold. On the ridges, Afghan warriors crouched behind rock sangars, arrows nocked, watching the dust cloud approach from the south. Shigi Kutuku brought his 30,000 cavalry to the valley entrance and stopped. He sat on his horse, perfectly still, studying the terrain. His officers waited behind him. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the wind whistling through the mountain passes and the jingle of horse tack. After 10 minutes, Shigi raised his hand. A signal. 300 Mongol riders peeled off from the main formation. They moved forward at a trot, spreading out across the valley floor. A probing attack, testing the defenses. On the ridges, Jalal's men watched them come. "Hold!" Igrak called to his Afghans. Wait for my signal." The Mongol riders advanced to within 200 meters of the forward positions, still moving, testing how close they could get. "Now," Igrak said quietly. 50 arrows flew from the ridges. The Mongols had expected this. They wheeled their horses, scattered, retreated back out of range. Only 3 men fell. The rest regrouped at the valley entrance. Shigi watched, nodded. The defensive positions were solid. The Afghans had good discipline. This wasn't going to be a quick breakthrough. He sent another probe, this time 500 riders, moving faster, trying to draw return fire, trying to see how many archers Jalal actually had on those ridges. More arrows. The Mongols retreated again, 6 more casualties. This continued for 3 hours. Probe, retreat, probe, retreat. Shigi was gathering intelligence, mapping the defensive positions, looking for weak points. He didn't find any. By midday, the Mongols pulled back to their camp. Shigi called his officers together. "They're well positioned," one of the commanders said. "The valley floor is a killing zone. We can't charge through it without taking heavy losses." "The ridges are too steep for a cavalry assault," another officer added. "We'd have to dismount. Send infantry up on foot. It would be slow, costly." Shigi stared at the valley. At the rock walls rising on either side, everything in Mongol doctrine said, you don't fight on terrain that favors the enemy. You maneuver. You force them to come out. You use your mobility to create opportunities. But Jalal wasn't coming out. "Tomorrow," Shigi said, "we probe deeper. Find where they're weak. Everyone has a weak point. We just need to find it." In the Khwarezmian camp that night, the mood was cautiously optimistic. "They're scared," one of the younger officers said. "They know they can't take us head on." Jalal shook his head. "They're not scared. They're being smart. Shigi's not going to throw his men away on a frontal assault. He's looking for an opening." "So what do we do?" Amin Malik asked. "We wait," Jalal said. "We make them come to us. And we don't break formation. No matter what they do, we hold." Igrak was sharpening his sword. He looked up. "My men are mountain fighters," he said. "They know how to wait. Patience is what we do." Jalal nodded. But there was something in his gut, a tension. The Mongols were too good, too professional. They were planning something. He just didn't know what. September 14th, Day 2. The dawn came cold. Mist hung in the valley like cobwebs. The Mongol camp stirred early. Riders mounted up, formations assembled. But something was different today. Shigi had ordered every spare horse in the camp brought forward, hundreds of them. His men tied bundles of straw and cloth to wooden frames, dressed them in armor, mounted them on the horses. From a distance, they looked like riders. By mid-morning, what appeared to be 60,000 Mongol cavalry stood at the valley entrance. The psychological impact was immediate. On the ridges, Afghan warriors stared at the massive force arrayed below them, twice the size of yesterday's army. Where had they come from? Had reinforcements arrived overnight? Murmurs spread through the defensive lines. "There's too many of them. We're outnumbered 2-1. We should retreat while we still can." Igrak moved along the ridgeline, talking to his men. "It's a trick," he said. "Look closely. Half of those riders aren't moving. They're dummies, straw men on horses." But not everyone believed him. Not everyone could see clearly enough from the ridges. Down in the main camp, Jalal was summoned by one of his scouts. "Commander, you need to see this." Jalal rode to a vantage point, looked down at the Mongol formation. 60,000 riders, at least that's what it looked like. His first thought was shock. How had Shigi doubled his force overnight? But then he looked more carefully, studied the formation, noticed that some sections were perfectly still. No movement, no fidgeting. Horses don't stand that still. He turned to Amin Malik. "It's a deception," Jalal said. "Half of those are fake." Malik squinted at the valley. "You're sure?" "Look at the left flank. Those riders haven't moved in 10 minutes. No horse stands that still. They're trying to make us think we're outnumbered, trying to break our nerve." Malik stared. Then he saw it too, the unnatural stillness. "Why would they do this?" he asked. This isn't a typical Mongol tactic. They don't need deception. They just overwhelm you. Jalal thought about that. And suddenly he understood. He's desperate, Jalal said quietly. Shigi knows he can't take us in this valley. He's trying psychological warfare. Make us think we're facing impossible odds. Force us to surrender or retreat. So what do? Nothing, Jalal said. We hold position, and we wait for him to make a real move. But the message went through the camp. The Mongol army is doubled. We're facing 60,000 riders, and not everyone got the word that it was fake. The afternoon of the second day, Shigi sent another probe. This time, 1,000 riders. They charged hard at the center of Jalal's line, as if testing whether fear had broken the coalition's nerve. The defensive positions held. Arrows flew from the ridges. The Mongols retreated. But Shigi had learned something. The center was strong. The Afghans on the left were solid. But the right flank, where Igrak's men held the ridgeline, that's where there was hesitation. That's where warriors had whispered about retreating. That was the weak point. That night, Shigi called his senior commanders. Tomorrow, he said, we hit the right flank. Full assault, break through their line. Once we're on the ridge, the rest will collapse. One of the officers hesitated. Commander, the terrain still favors them. Even if we take the ridge, we'll take heavy casualties. Shigi looked at him. The Khan sent us to finish this. If Jalal al-Din escapes again, if he rebuilds his force, the entire region will rise up. We end this tomorrow, whatever the cost. The officer nodded. They were going all in. September 15th, day 3. The sun rose blood-red over the Hindu Kush. Jalal stood on the ridgeline, looking down at the Mongol camp. They were forming up. This was different from the probing attacks. This was battle formation. Full commitment. Amin Malik rode up beside him. This is it, Malik said. Jalal nodded. Make sure every unit knows. When they do the feigned retreat, nobody chases. Hold the line. Wait for my signal. And if they break through, they won't. But Jalal's hand was tight on his sword hilt. Because he knew how good the Mongols were. He knew they didn't lose. And today everything would be decided. The Mongol assault began at mid-morning. 10,000 cavalry, formed in a massive wedge, charged straight at the right flank where Saif al-Din Igrak commanded the Afghan positions. The sound was like thunder. 30,000 hooves hitting the valley floor. The ground shook. Dust rose in massive clouds. On the ridges, Igrak's men watched them come. These were mountain fighters. They'd spent their lives in these valleys. They knew every rock, every pass, every shadow. But most of them had never faced the Mongol army, never stood against a cavalry charge that had broken every defense from China to Persia. Every instinct was screaming at them to run. "Hold!" Igrak shouted. "Stand and shoot! Hold your ground!" The Afghans rose from behind their rock sangars, drew their bows. 5,000 archers, shooting from elevation. The arrows fell like rain. Mongols tumbled from their saddles. Horses screamed and went down. But the charge kept coming. The riders in the rear simply rode over the fallen, maintaining momentum. 200 meters, 150, 100. "Again!" Igrak shouted. Another volley. More Mongols fell. The charge was losing cohesion now, the front ranks thinning as arrows found their marks. At 50 meters, the Mongol wedge hit a wall of arrows and broke apart. They couldn't maintain the charge up the slope, couldn't keep formation under that rain of fire. And then, perfectly executed, the Mongols turned and ran. The feigned retreat, the oldest trick in the Mongol playbook. Pretend to break, pretend to run, lure the enemy into chasing you, then wheel around and destroy them while they're out of formation. Igrak had been warned about this. Jalal had drilled it into every commander. When the Mongols run, you hold your position. You don't chase, you wait. "Hold!" Igrak screamed. "Don't chase! Hold the line!" Most of his men obeyed, stood their ground, watched the Mongols retreating down the slope, but 500 warriors couldn't help themselves. They were young, inexperienced. They'd just watched the mighty Mongol army break and run from their position. Every warrior instinct they had said, "Pursue, press the advantage, finish them." They broke ranks, charged down the slope after the retreating Mongols. Igrak saw it happening. "No, get back! It's a trap!" Too late. The 500 Afghans were running full speed down the valley slope, screaming war cries, drunk on the sight of Mongols fleeing. They made it 100 meters before the Mongols turned around. It happened so fast. One moment the Mongols were retreating in disorder. The next, they'd wheeled their horses, reformed, and were charging back up the slope. The 500 Afghans were caught in the open, no cover, no support, completely exposed. The Mongol cavalry hit them like a hammer. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. From the ridge line, Igrak and his men watched in horror as their brothers were cut down, surrounded, overwhelmed. In 5 minutes, all 500 were dead. The silence that followed was crushing. The Afghans on the ridge stood frozen. They'd just watched 500 men die because they broke discipline, because they chased. And down in the valley, the Mongols were reforming, celebrating. They'd just proved once again that their tactics worked, that their feigned retreat was unbeatable. Shigi Kutuku, watching from his command position, allowed himself a smile. The enemy was shaken. Their morale was damaged. One more push and the whole defensive line would collapse. But Shigi had made a mistake. He was so focused on the right flank, on the 500 dead Afghans, that he didn't notice what was happening in the center. Jalal al-Din had been watching from his command post. He'd seen the feigned retreat, seen his men chase, seen them die. For a moment, rage washed through him. At the Mongols, yes, but more at the situation. 500 good men dead because discipline broke for just a moment. But rage wasn't useful right now. Grief wasn't useful. What was useful was this. The Mongols had just committed their main force to the right flank. Their center was exposed, and they were celebrating. Disorganized, vulnerable. Jalal turned to Amin Malik. "Get every cavalry commander to me. Now, we attack in 5 minutes." Malik stared. "Attack? Now?" "Right now, while they think they're winning." Orders flew through the coalition lines. 5,000 cavalry, the elite riders, Khwarezmian professionals who'd served under Shah Mohammed, Turkish heavy cavalry under Amin Malik's command, men who could match the Mongols stride for stride. They formed up quietly, behind the ridgeline where the Mongols couldn't see. Jalal rode to the front, drew his sword. "When we hit them," he said to his officers, "we hit hard, straight into their center. Don't spread out. Don't get pulled into individual combats. Stay together, drive deep, break their formation. 5,000 men against 30,000 Mongols. It should have been suicide." Jalal raised his sword. "For the Empire," he said quietly. Then louder, "For our families, for everyone they killed, for everyone they burned. Today, the Mongols learn what defeat feels like." He kicked his horse forward. 5,000 cavalry surged over the ridgeline and thundered down into the valley. The Mongols saw them coming, but they were out of position. Their main force was still on the right flank, still celebrating the slaughter of the 500 Afghans. Their center was thin, exposed. Shigi Kutuku screamed orders. "Reform! Face center! Defensive formation!" But it was too late. Jalal's cavalry hit the Mongol center like a spear through cloth. The impact was devastating. 5,000 riders, fresh, organized, moving at full gallop, crashed into 3,000 Mongols who were trying desperately to form a defensive line. The Mongol formation shattered. Jalal was in the front rank, sword swinging. He cut down a Mongol officer, drove his horse forward, kept moving. Around him, his cavalry carved through the Mongol lines. This wasn't the careful tactical warfare the Mongols excelled at. This was chaos, close-quarters brutality. And for the first time in their careers, the Mongol warriors found themselves on the wrong end of it. Shigi tried to rally his forces, tried to bring the right flank back to support the center. But the valley was too narrow. His cavalry couldn't maneuver, couldn't execute the pincer movements and flanking attacks that were their signature. They were jammed together, packed into a space too small for their numbers, and suddenly, from the ridges, arrows began to fall. The Afghans, watching Jalal's charge, found their courage again. They rose from their positions and began shooting, not at the front ranks, but at the rear, at the Mongols trying to reinforce the center. The valley floor became a killing zone. Mongols were being hit from three sides. Jalal's cavalry in front, archers from the left ridge, more archers from the right. They tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. They tried to charge, but they were hemmed in by their own numbers. For 15 years, the Mongol army had never been in this position, never been trapped, never been unable to maneuver. Now, packed into a narrow valley, their greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. And for the first time in their lives, these veteran warriors began to feel something unfamiliar. Panic. I want you to really understand what happened next. These were men who'd conquered half of Asia, who'd never lost, who'd been trained from childhood that they were superior to every other fighting force on earth. And now, they were dying, not in glorious combat, not in a fair fight. They were being slaughtered like animals in a pen. The formation began to crack. Officers shouted orders, but the orders couldn't be executed. There was no room to maneuver, no space to reform. Jalal saw it, saw the moment when confidence became doubt, became terror. He raised his sword high, screamed at the top of his lungs. "All units, general advance, drive them into the ground." Every Khwarezmian soldier heard that order. Every Turkish cavalryman, every Afghan warrior on the ridges who'd been waiting, watching, holding position. They all charged at once. 60,000 men against 30,000 Mongols who were already breaking. The Mongol formation collapsed. What followed wasn't a battle. It was a massacre. Men threw down their weapons and ran. Some tried to surrender, raising their hands, shouting for mercy in languages their attackers didn't speak or didn't care to understand. There was no mercy. These were men who'd seen Bukhara burn, who'd heard the stories from Nishapur and Bamiyan, who'd watched cities reduced to rubble and populations slaughtered. The rage that had been building for 2 years, the trauma and grief and helpless fury, all of it came out in that valley. The killing went on for hours. Mongols tried to fight their way out. Some succeeded. Most didn't. They tried to climb the ridges. Afghan warriors waited at the top with knives and swords. They tried to retreat back down the valley. Cavalry ran them down. By nightfall, the valley floor was carpeted with bodies. 15,000 Mongols. Dead. 15,000 out of 30,000. That's a 50% casualty rate. In military terms, that's not a defeat. That's annihilation. Hundreds more were captured alive. And here's where the story gets dark, where you see what war does to people, what trauma and grief turn into. The Khwarezmian soldiers took the captured Mongols to the center of their camp. They executed them by hammering wooden stakes into their ears. It's a gruesome detail. The medieval chroniclers recorded it. And it tells you everything you need to know about the rage these men were carrying. This wasn't about military strategy. This wasn't about tactics or honor. This was about vengeance, about making the Mongols feel even a fraction of the pain they'd inflicted. Shigi Kutuku escaped with the remnants of his force, maybe 12,000 riders, battered, broken, traumatized. Imagine being him in that moment. You're the adopted son of Genghis Khan. You've been given command of 30,000 elite warriors, and you're running away, having lost half your army to a prince everyone thought was finished. The shame must have been unbearable. His officers rode beside him in silence. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? They'd lost. The Mongol army, undefeated for 15 years, had just been destroyed in a narrow valley in Afghanistan. Behind them, the sounds of celebration echoed off the mountain walls. Victory songs, war cries, the kind of sounds you make when you've done the impossible. In the coalition camp that night, the mood was electric. Soldiers who'd been terrified 3 days ago were now dancing, singing, drinking, sharing stories of the battle. They'd defeated the Mongols, the undefeatable, the unstoppable force, and word was already spreading. Riders had been sent in every direction, to Merv, to Balkh, to Bukhara, to every city that had surrendered to the Mongols, every town that had given up hope. The message was simple: the Mongols can be beaten. In Merv, a commander named Qutb al-Din Khoshtagin heard the news and immediately rose in rebellion. He rallied the citizens, expelled the small Mongol garrison, and declared the city free. In Balkh, the people drove out the Mongol administrators. In Bukhara, uprisings began in the streets. For the first time since this nightmare began in 1219, people believed that maybe, just maybe, the Mongol conquest could be stopped. And in the center of the coalition camp, sitting by a fire, Jalal al-Din composed a message. He wrote it carefully, made sure every word was perfect. Then he gave it to his fastest rider. "Take this to Genghis Khan," Jalal said. "Wherever he is, find him. Make sure he reads this." The rider looked at the message. Read it. His eyes went wide. The message was short, direct, and breathtaking in its audacity. "In which locality do you want the battle to be, so that we may make our way to it?" Jalal al-Din wasn't running, wasn't hiding. He was challenging Genghis Khan to a rematch. "Choose your battlefield," the message said. "I'll meet you there, and I'll beat you again." The rider left at dawn, rode hard, carried that message across hundreds of miles. When it reached Genghis Khan, the Khan's reaction would change everything. But that night, September 15th, 1221, none of that had happened yet. That night, Jalal al-Din sat alone on a ridge overlooking the valley. Below him, 60,000 men celebrated. They'd earned it. They'd done something no one else had managed in 15 years. But Jalal wasn't celebrating. He was thinking about what came next, because he knew Genghis Khan, knew the man's reputation, knew that the Khan had built his empire on the principle that resistance was futile, that defeat was impossible, and now one of his armies had been destroyed. The Khan would come, not with 30,000 men, with everything, with the full weight of the Mongol Empire, and Jalal had 60,000 warriors, maybe, if he could keep them together. If the coalition held, that was the question. Could he keep this alliance intact? Could he maintain discipline and unity long enough to face what was coming? He didn't know. But for tonight, for this one night, they'd won. They'd proved that the Mongols could bleed, could die, could be beaten. Jalal stood, looked at the stars, thought about his father, dead on an island somewhere, thought about his empire, shattered and burned. And he thought about tomorrow. Whatever came next, whatever Genghis Khan sent against him, Jalal al-Din would be ready, or at least he'd try to be. He walked back down to camp, to his commanders, to his men. They had won the battle. Now came the hard part, winning the war. The evening after the battle should have been perfect. September 15th, 1221. The sun was setting over Parwan Valley, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of gold and crimson. Below, in the coalition camp, 60,000 men were celebrating the greatest upset in military history. They'd earned it. They'd done what everyone said was impossible. They'd beaten the Mongol army. Fires burned across the camp. Men shared food and wine. They told stories of the battle, exaggerated their own heroism, laughed at how the mighty Mongols had run. Across the encampment, officers divided into groups. Amin Malik sat with his Turkish cavalry, recounting how they'd broken the Mongol center. Igrak gathered with his Afghans, honoring the 500 who'd died. Temur Malik, the Persian commander who'd brought his small but fierce contingent to this alliance months ago, sat with the Khwarezmian regulars, quietly celebrating with men who'd survived the empire's collapse. In the center of camp, officers were dividing the spoils, Mongol horses, armor, weapons, the captured supplies of an entire army. That's when the argument started. It was a horse, a white stallion, Mongol breed, beautiful animal. Probably belonged to one of Shigi's senior officers. the kind of horse that marked status, power. Two men wanted it: Amin Malik, 50 years old, Turkish commander. More importantly, Jalal al-Din's father-in-law, a man who'd brought 10,000 cavalry to this alliance, a man who expected respect, and Saif al-Din Igrak, 45, the Afghan chieftain who'd brought 30,000 warriors down from the mountains, whose men had held the ridges, who'd watched 500 of his warriors die today. Both men stood in front of that stallion. Both claimed it was rightfully theirs. The argument grew heated. Officers gathered around, started taking sides. Someone called for Jalal. Jalal al-Din was exhausted. He'd spent 3 days commanding a battle. Barely slept, barely eaten. His mind was already racing ahead to what came next, to Genghis Khan's response, to keeping the coalition together. He didn't want to deal with this, didn't want to referee a dispute over livestock, but he was the commander. This was his job. He walked to the center of camp, saw the two men facing each other, saw the horse between them, saw the officers watching. "What's the problem?" Jalal asked. Amin Malik spoke first. "That horse is mine by right. I commanded the cavalry that broke the Mongol center. My men took it." Igrak stepped forward. "My warriors held the ridges. Without us, there would have been no victory. The spoils should be shared fairly." Jalal looked at both men, looked at the horse, felt the weight of 60,000 eyes on him. This should have been simple. A commander worth his salt would have made a judgment, split the difference, found a compromise, moved on. But Jalal was tired. And Amin Malik was his father-in-law. The man had stood by him when everyone else fled, had brought troops when Jalal had nothing. "The horse goes to Amin Malik," Jalal said. The decision came out flat, final, no discussion. Igrak stared at him. "You're choosing your father-in-law over the warriors who bled for you today?" "I've made my decision," Jalal said. He turned to walk away, thought the matter was settled. Then Amin Malik stepped forward, pulled a riding whip from his belt, and before anyone could react, he struck Saif al-Din Igrak across the face. The crack of leather on skin echoed across the camp. Everything stopped. Igrak stood there, hand to his cheek, blood trickling between his fingers. His eyes were wide with shock, then with humiliation, then with rage. In the warrior cultures of medieval Central Asia, this wasn't just an insult. This was the ultimate degradation. Igrak was a leader, a commander. His men had just fought and died following his orders, and he'd been whipped. Like a slave, like a dog, in front of the entire army. The silence stretched out, thick, dangerous. Jalal saw it happening, saw the line being crossed, opened his mouth to say something, to fix this. But what could he say? The damage was done. Igrak looked at Jalal, at Amin Malik, at the officers watching. He didn't say a word. He turned and walked away. That night the Afghan camp was quiet. No celebrations, no songs, just 30,000 men sitting around their fires talking in low voices. Igrak called his senior warriors together. "We're leaving," he said. One of the officers protested. "We just won the greatest victory of our lives. The Mongols are broken. This is our chance to—" "We're leaving," Igrak repeated. His hand was still on his cheek where the whip had struck. "At dawn. I want everyone ready to march." "Where are we going?" "Home. Back to the mountains." "But Jalal al-Din," Igrak said slowly, "chose his father-in-law over us. He let me be humiliated in front of the entire army. We came down from our mountains because we thought he was different. We thought he valued honor, loyalty." He spat. "We were wrong." The officers looked at each other. Nobody argued. They'd all seen what happened. They'd all felt the insult. Orders went through the Afghan contingent. Quiet, careful, pack your gear, be ready to move at dawn. And here's the detail that shows how angry they were, how calculated this was. They kept their campfires burning, made it look like they were still there, still part of the army. By dawn they planned to be gone. Jalal woke to chaos. It was just after sunrise. One of his scouts was shaking him awake. "Commander, you need to see this." Jalal stumbled out of his tent, looked toward the Afghan section of camp. The fires were still burning, but something was wrong. There was no movement. No sounds of men preparing breakfast. No voices. He rode to the Afghan camp, walked between the tents. They were empty, every single one. 30,000 men, gone, vanished in the night like ghosts. Amin Malik rode up beside him, looked at the empty camp. His face went pale. "Where did they go?" he asked. Jalal didn't answer, just stood there, staring at the abandoned tents. Someone found a message, scratched in the dirt near one of the fires. "We came for honor. We found insult. The mountains are calling us home." That was it. No threats, no demands, just 30,000 warriors who'd decided they were done. Jalal sat down on a rock, put his head in his hands. "Let me be clear about what just happened. Let me make sure you understand the magnitude of this disaster. Yesterday, Jalal al-Din had 60,000 men. He'd just handed the Mongol army its worst defeat in 15 years. Cities were rising in rebellion. The entire dynamic of the war was changing. Today, he had 30,000. He'd lost half his army overnight, because he couldn't manage one dispute, because pride mattered more than unity. Amin Malik tried to speak. "I didn't think—" "No," Jalal said quietly. "You didn't think, and I didn't think, and now 30,000 warriors are gone." "We still have 30,000, Malik said. "That's still a substantial force." Jalal looked at him. "Genghis Khan is coming. Not with 30,000, with everything, with the full Mongol army. And you think 30,000 men is enough?" Malik had no answer. Jalal stood, called his remaining officers together. "Listen to me," he said. "Genghis Khan knows about Parwan by now. He's going to come for us. And when he comes, it won't be Shigi Kutuku leading a cleanup mission. It'll be the Khan himself with every warrior he can muster." "So what do we do?" Temur Malik asked. Jalal stared at the Hindu Kush, at the mountains rising to the east. "We run," he said. "We take everyone who will follow us, and we run for India. Maybe there, beyond the mountains, we can find safety. Regroup." "That's hundreds of miles," someone said. "Through mountain passes, with the Mongols behind us." "I know," Jalal said, "but it's the only chance we have." The orders went out. "Pack the camp. Prepare to march. Anyone who wants to come with us, tell them to be ready by noon." By midday, Jalal's column was forming up, 30,000 soldiers. And something worse, 50,000 refugees, civilians, families, old people, children. They'd heard about the victory at Parwan. They thought maybe, just maybe, they could escape the Mongol occupation. They came from Ghazni, from Kabul, from a dozen smaller towns, all of them looking at Jalal like he was their last hope. And Jalal knew what those refugees meant. They'd slow everything down. What should have been a fast military march would become a trudging migration. But how could he turn them away? How could he tell families who'd lost everything that there was no room for them? "They come with us," Jalal said. "All of them." Amin Malik shook his head. "That's 80,000 people. The Mongols can move 100 kilometers a day. We'll be lucky to make 50 with this many civilians." "They come with us," Jalal repeated. The column moved out. 30,000 soldiers, 50,000 refugees, moving east toward the Indus River, toward India, toward the hope of safety. Behind them, somewhere to the west, the Mongol army was coming. And the math was simple, brutal, inevitable. They were going to get caught. The news of Parwan reached Genghis Khan 3 days after the battle. He was in the process of consolidating his control over the western territories of the Khwarezmian Empire. The war, as far as he was concerned, was effectively over. Just cleanup work remained. Then a rider arrived, exhausted, covered in dust. He carried a message from Shigi Kutuku. Genghis read it, stood very still for a long moment. Then he called his sons, his senior generals, every commander within a day's ride. "Jalal al-Din has defeated our forces at Parwan," he announced. 15,000 of our warriors are dead." The silence was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For 15 years, the Mongol army had been invincible. The foundation of the empire, the source of its power, was the idea that resistance was futile, that the Mongols couldn't be beaten. And now, in one afternoon, a refugee prince with a collection of tribesmen had shattered that myth. "We ride south," Genghis said. "Immediately, full force. I want every available warrior assembled within 3 days. We're going to finish this personally." One of his generals spoke up. "Great Khan, the Western territories aren't fully pacified. If we pull the main army—" "Do you think the Western territories will stay pacified if word spreads that the Mongols can be defeated?" Genghis asked quietly. "Every city we conquered will rise in rebellion. Every prince who surrendered will pick up his sword again." He turned to face his commanders. "Jalal al-Din has to be destroyed, publicly, completely, so that no one else gets the idea that resistance is possible." The orders went out. The main Mongol army, over 100,000 strong, began moving south toward Afghanistan. Genghis himself rode ahead with the vanguard. He stopped at Parwan Valley, walked through the battlefield, looked at the 15,000 Mongol corpses still lying in the dust. Shigi Kutuku was there, waiting, expecting to be executed, expecting disgrace. Genghis studied him for a long moment. "You did not know the place of battle," the Khan said finally, "and you were both at fault." Both, meaning Shigi and the terrain itself. It was a strange statement, almost philosophical, an acknowledgement that Shigi had been beaten not just by Jalal's skill, but by the geography, by fighting on ground that negated every Mongol advantage. But here's what's remarkable about this moment. Genghis didn't execute Shigi, didn't strip him of rank, didn't even berate him. Instead, he educated him. He walked Shigi through the battlefield, pointed out where the formation had been vulnerable, explained how Jalal had exploited the terrain, where the mistakes had been made. It was like getting a master class in military strategy from history's most successful conqueror, except your tuition payment was the death of half your men. When the lesson was done, Genghis turned to his assembled generals. "Jalal al-Din is heading east, toward the Indus River. He has maybe 30,000 soldiers and twice that many refugees. We'll catch him in 2 weeks, maybe less." "What are your orders when we find him?" one of the generals asked. Genghis looked at the valley one more time, at the bodies, at the rocks still stained with Mongol blood. "Total annihilation," he said. "No survivors, no prisoners. We end this." For 6 weeks, Jalal's column trudged east, through mountain passes, across plains, always moving, always looking over their shoulders. The refugees slowed everything. People got sick. The elderly couldn't keep up. Children cried. Supplies ran low. Jalal pushed them as hard as he dared, but there was only so fast 80,000 people could move. Behind them, the Mongol army was closing in. Riders reported sightings, Mongol scouts shadowing their column, getting closer every day. By late October, Jalal knew they weren't going to make it to India. Not before the Mongols caught them. He had to make a stand. He chose the Indus River. November 24, 1221, near what's now Calabar in modern Pakistan. The Indus River was right there, brown water churning, the far bank visible. India beyond it. Safety. But between Jalal and the river stood the Mongol army. Genghis Khan himself commanded, not Shigi, not a subordinate general. The great Khan, personally, leading over 100,000 warriors. His sons, Chagatai and Ogadai, commanded the wings, elite units, veterans who'd conquered half of Asia. Jalal formed up his 30,000 troops with their backs to the river. He commanded the center with his 5,000 best cavalry. Amin Malik took the right with the Turkish forces. On the left, Temur Malik positioned his Persian contingent alongside what remained of the various smaller units. The 50,000 refugees huddled behind the army, terrified, trapped, nowhere to run. This was it. This was the end. Everyone there knew it. The battle began at dawn. The Mongol wings advanced, methodical, professional, no mistakes this time. No narrow valley to constrain them. This was open ground, Mongol terrain. Taimur Malik's left flank fought with desperate courage. Against all odds, they actually pushed Ogeday's forces back initially. For a moment, it looked like maybe, just maybe, another miracle was possible. But Genghis Khan had learned his lesson at Parwan. He watched the battle unfold, saw the strength of Jalal's defensive position on the riverbank, saw how the troops were arranged. And he sent an elite unit under a general named Bela to circle wide, to climb the heights overlooking the battlefield, to attack from above. It was the same tactic Jalal had used at Parwan, using terrain, using elevation, hitting the enemy where they were vulnerable. Genghis had studied that battle, learned from it, and now he was using Jalal's own strategy against him. Bela's unit gained the heights, began raining arrows down into the rear of Jalal's formation. The defensive line began to buckle. Taimur Malik died fighting, cut down by Mongol cavalry as his position was overrun. The left flank collapsed. The Mongols poured through the gap. Jalal saw it happening, saw his army disintegrating around him. He had maybe 5 minutes before the formation broke completely, 5 minutes before it became a rout, a massacre. He looked around, at his men dying, and at the refugees screaming, at the Mongol army closing in like a vice. And he looked at the Indus River, 20 feet down from the bank, maybe more. The current was vicious, swollen with autumn rains, brown water churning with debris and mud. Nobody could survive jumping into that. The fall alone would probably kill you, and if it didn't, you'd drown. But staying here meant certain death. Staying here meant capture, torture, public execution, an example for the entire empire. Jalal al-Din made his choice. He turned his horse toward the river. "Commander!" someone shouted. "Where are you going?" Jalal didn't answer, just kicked his horse into a gallop, straight at the riverbank. Men screamed for him to stop. Officers tried to follow. Mongol arrows filled the air around him. He didn't slow down. At the edge of the cliff, with the water churning 20 feet below, with 100,000 people watching, Jalal al-Din did something that would become legend. He jumped. Horse and rider together launched off that bank into empty air. For a moment they were flying, suspended, defying gravity and reason and every instinct that says you don't do this. Then they hit the water. The impact should have killed them. The current should have dragged them under. The weight of armor and weapons should have pulled Jalal to the bottom. Somehow, none of that happened. Somehow, impossibly, Jalal resurfaced, still in the saddle. The horse was swimming, strong strokes, fighting the current. They were being carried downstream, fast. The water was trying to pull them under, but the horse kept swimming, kept fighting, and Jalal held on. For 5 minutes, maybe 10, they fought the river. Every second, Jalal expected to drown, expected the horse to go under, expected the current to win, but they made it. The horse's hooves found the far bank, scrambled for purchase, pulled them up onto the rocks. Jalal al-Din collapsed on the ground, gasping, alive. On the far bank, the battle was ending. His army was being destroyed. The refugees were being slaughtered. Everything he'd fought for was dying. But he was alive. Genghis Khan stood on the near bank, watched Jalal make that jump, watched him disappear into the water, watched him surface, watched him reach the far side. The Khan stood there for a long moment, silent. Then he turned to his officers, and he said something that was recorded by multiple chroniclers, something that tells you everything about what kind of man Genghis Khan was. A father should be happy to have such a son. Think about that. This was the man who'd just spent 2 years destroying Jalal's empire, who'd killed his father, who'd burned his cities, who was, at that very moment, finishing the annihilation of Jalal's army. And he stood there and expressed admiration for his enemy. That's the respect of one warrior for another. That's the acknowledgement that sometimes, even in defeat, there's glory. Let's talk about what Parwan actually meant. It was the only significant defeat the Mongols suffered during their entire Central Asian campaign, the only one. Every other battle, every other siege, every other engagement, the Mongols won. Parwan stands alone as proof that they weren't invincible, that the right commander with the right strategy and the right terrain could beat them. Jalal al-Din showed the world three things you needed: superior knowledge of terrain, the discipline not to fall for Mongol tricks, and the courage to actually stand and fight. Most armies of the period had none of those. Jalal had all three, but he won the battle and lost the war. And the reason he lost wasn't military, it was political. It was personal. Leadership isn't just about winning battles, it's about managing people. Understanding that the warrior who's been humiliated in front of his troops is a warrior who's going to leave. Understanding that ego and pride can destroy more than any enemy army. Genghis Khan understood this. That's why he didn't execute Shigi after Parwan. That's why he educated him instead. The Khan knew that maintaining loyalty, maintaining morale, was as important as tactical genius. Jalal knew tactics. He proved that at Parwan. But he didn't understand people. And that's why, in the end, he lost everything. Jalal al-Din survived for another decade. He wandered through Persia, Azerbaijan, Anatolia. Sometimes as a conqueror, sometimes as a refugee. He won battles, lost battles, tried to rebuild his power base. He never managed to reclaim his empire. In 1231, 10 years after the Indus River, he was killed. The exact circumstances are murky. Probably Kurdish villagers, maybe assassins. The medieval sources disagree. What they agree on is this: the last sultan of the Khwarezmian Empire died far from home, far from power, still fighting. Afghanistan remembered, though, the same mountains where Jalal made his stand would break other empires. The British in the 1800s, the Soviets in the 1980s, the Americans in the 2000s. There is something about that terrain, about the warrior culture, about the refusal to submit. It's lasted 800 years. Parwan proved it wasn't about being the strongest or having the best technology. It was about knowing the land, fighting on your own terms, and never giving up. But it also proved something else, something harder to accept, that sometimes victory isn't enough, that the greatest enemy isn't always the army in front of you, that pride and ego left unchecked can destroy everything you've built. On November 24, 1221, as Jalal al-Din pulled himself up on the far bank of the Indus River, dripping wet, exhausted, alone, he must have looked back at the battlefield one last time, at his army being destroyed, at the refugees being slaughtered, at the Mongol banners waving in victory. And he must have thought about that night after Parwan, when Amin Malik struck Igrak with a whip, when 30,000 warriors decided they'd had enough. That was the moment he lost the war, not at the Indus River, not against Genghis Khan's superior force. He lost it over one dispute, one failure of leadership, one moment when pride mattered more than unity. Standing there on the far bank, alive but defeated, Jalal al-Din knew exactly where it had all gone wrong. No force is truly unstoppable. Every giant has a weakness. Every empire has its limits. But victory means nothing if you can't hold your people together afterward. That's the lesson of Parwan. That's what Jalal al-Din learned too late, standing on the banks of the Indus River. The battles we fight, the victories we win, they only matter if we can maintain unity afterward, if we can put pride aside, if we can manage egos, if we can keep the coalition together. Otherwise, we're just repeating history's oldest mistake, winning the battle, losing the war over something that, in the end, didn't matter at all.